Hello everyone, how are you? Today I'll walk you through my process to create this 3D Toon avocado made in Blender. Let's go! I started with the default cube and added a subdivision modifier. In edit mode, I started working with this little geometry, and with the help of proportional editing, I tried to get something close to the shape of an avocado. To keep working on the shape, I needed some more geometry, so I applied the subdivision modifier and I continued working on the shape in edit mode. Then I deleted half of my mesh since I wanted half an avocado. I continued trying to get the shape I wanted by scaling and moving some edge loops. This was more of an intuitive process. And when I felt I needed more geometry to be able to refine the shape of my model, I added a few loop cuts and kept moving some vertices. I slid some edge loops as well, and when I felt a bit lost and couldn't get the exact shape I wanted, I used the annotation tool to draw the shape I wanted to achieve, and I tried to match that shape by moving and scaling some vertices and some edge loops. And once I finished, I deleted the annotation from the timeline. I added a subdivision modifier to make the model smoother and gave the final touches to the avocado. Since this edge loop was irregular, I aligned it by scaling it to 0 on the axis that I needed to. All that was left at this point was to fill this edge loop, inset face and extrude to the inside shaft a tiny bit. And inset face one more time. And one small touch-up before going back to object mode. To create the seed, I used a cube with a subdivision modifier, since that will give me cleaner topology than a sphere. I scaled both the seed and the avocado so their proportions look good together. To make the arms, I also used a cube with a subdivision modifier, and since I needed 2 arms, I also added a mirror modifier. I wanted the arms to look like they were hugging the seed, so I started by moving this face and rotating it, and when I needed more geometry to make the arm bend, I added a loop cut right in the middle and I continued moving the faces. And then I just kept moving some faces until the arms looked like they were hugging the seed. I gave some final touches to both the arms and the seed, and I was ready for creating the materials. Before creating the materials, I aligned the camera to my view quickly with the Ctrl-Alt-0 shortcut. I created a simple Toon material for all of my meshes. Since this Toon shader is reactive to light, I recommend placing the light before going back to the materials to choose the colors and the final position of the highlights and the shadows. For the lighting, I used only a sunlight and I rotated until I liked the placement of the shadows. For the seed, I chose 3 colors, a shadow, a fill, and a highlight color. For the avocado, I wanted different colors, so I needed 4 materials and I assigned a light yellowish material to the center, and to avoid the material looking weird, I had to inset a face. Then I assigned a light green material to the border and I had to add another color stop so the color appeared. I think it was a glitch. the outside borders needed another material, so I chose 2 green shades. And for the rest, I chose the same dark green as I chose for the previous material and a lighter green. For the arms, I used the same yellowish material that I used for the inside, but I moved one color stop to move the placement of the shadows. Finally, I changed my color management. For the outline, I added 3 line art modifiers. The first one was for the avocado. I kept the line thickness at 25 and I chose a dark green material. The second line art modifier was for the seed. I chose a dark brown material and I decided to give a bit more thickness to this outline. And the last line art modifier was for the arms. I put all these 3 outlines in the same layer. I gave it a dark yellowish color and a thick outline. After I added the avocado's line art modifier, the avocado's outline was looking off, so I had to change the geometry until I liked the way the outline looked. I decided to move my camera to the side a bit, so the outline was a bit more noticeable since the line art modifier works in relation to the camera. I kept changing the geometry of the back of the avocado to get the outline I wanted. Since the back wasn't going to be visible in the final render, I didn't care that much about how good it looked, so my main focus was what kind of outline I was getting. Having the camera view in one of my areas and the 3D viewport in another one was really helpful to check how modifying the geometry was changing the outline in real time. I kept playing with the geometry for a while, and finally I gave the final touches in object mode by playing with the scale a bit. I added one more subdivision to the subdivision modifier, so the line art looked smoother along with the mesh. I did the same for the seed subdivision modifier, and I scaled it down a bit. I also added a smooth modifier to the grease pencil object, so the outline looked even smoother. Since I wanted the outline to be in the entire seed, to get the look I wanted, I had to draw the other half. So in a new layer using the circle tool, I drew a circle. I used Shift to make a perfect circle and Alt to create the circle from the center point. That way I had a symmetrical centered circle. In edit mode, I scaled and placed the circle. And I had to delete half of my circle so it didn't overlap with the line art I already had. Since my circle looked thicker than the outline, I used normalized thickness to get the exact width as the line art. I also had to move some points so they were closer to the mesh. Again, having my camera view on the left side was really helpful and made my process faster. When I needed my stroke to be a bit longer, I used the extrusion tool. And I kept moving the points until the circle didn't look wobbly. I smoothed the strokes in sculpt mode a bit. It took me a while to get this outline right, since I had to make it look smooth and connected to the line art modifier at the same time. I went back and forward from edit mode to move the points to sculpt mode to smooth them. And to get a flat color, I disabled use lights in both layers. And I had to make sure this stroke was in the bottom layer and my outline was done. To create the eyes, I added a cube with a subdivision modifier. I scaled it on the y-axis to make it flatter and on the z-axis to make it more oval. And I needed another eye, so I added a mirror modifier. To create the pupils, I duplicated the eyes, scaled them down, and I placed them forward a bit. For the materials, I made a simple Toon shader for both the eyes and the pupils. I applied the pupils mirror modifier and gave each pupil a different material, so I could control the placement of their colors separately. I moved the pupils a bit, and since there was a weird shadow that was bothering me, I changed the pupils shadow mode to none. To make the highlights glow, I simply chose a value over 1 in the color ramp and I enabled bloom. In previous videos, I made the eyes using grease pencil, so if you like that kind of look better, you can go watch these 2 videos. For the mouth, I also started with a cube with a subdivision modifier, and by using the bevel tool, moving some faces, adding some loop cuts, and moving some edges, I gave a curvy shape to the mesh. Enabling proportional editing was pretty handy while modeling the mouth. I gave the mouth a Toon shader as well, and I increased the subdivisions in the modifier to make it smoother. For the background, I added these nodes to make a procedural background, and I separated the lighting from the background color. If you like a more in-depth video about procedural backgrounds, you can check this video out. And if you like to create another cute 3D character, you can watch this video. As always, thanks for watching and see you in the next one. Bye!